Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 22nd of November, Thanksgiving Eve, and welcome to Alaska Weather. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you'd like to check on your very latest weather conditions, and you should, especially in western Alaska tonight and tomorrow and through the rest of the holiday weekend, give us a call at the Alaska Weather Information Line, 1-800-472-0391, an easy way to stay up to date with your forecast on the phone. Online, weather.gov/Alaska is the place to go. One click on the map will take you to your local weather forecast office from Fairbanks and the team in Anchorage, the team in Juneau. And you can narrow down your forecast information very quickly on those web pages there. Now, if you can't find what you want, feel free anytime to send me an email. I'm happy to talk about the weather with you, take a look at the wonderful weather pictures from your community and village, or just help you find what you need on our websites. David.Snider is the easy way to find me at NOAA.gov on the email there. Let's get right to it. Out across the west, blizzard warnings are still in effect this afternoon and into the early evening hours for the northwestern coast. Poor visibility and falling snow along with some very gusty winds continue there. However, we expect conditions to ease up and improve as we go through the nighttime hours and into tomorrow. So good news that blizzard conditions should be winding down as we get into the next probably 8 to 10 hours or so. Now, a little bit further southward, we're still looking at blizzard conditions across the Norton Sound communities and up into the lower Yukon Delta region, and also across St. Lawrence Island and the western end of the Seward Peninsula around the Bering Strait. Blizzard conditions will continue there, as well as snow and wind. So be prepared for dangerous travel conditions, certainly in those regions, with some improvement by the afternoon tomorrow. A look further southward also includes winter weather advisories for Bethel and the Bristol Bay region there. Looking at coastal flood advisories for flooding potential or a higher surge about 2 to 4 feet above normal high tide that's coming in. And so we expect to see some beach erosion with that, as well as some high surf, as well as some flooding of low-lying areas, minor flooding at this point. So 2 to 4 feet above the high tide there, as well as winter weather advisories for the region. High wind warnings are in effect for areas east of Unalaska, which pretty much means Akutan and eastward all the way up through the Alaska Peninsula. Gusts in this region, again, so not necessarily anything west of Unalaska, but gusts east of Unalaska toward the Alaska Peninsula could reach upwards of 90 miles an hour. And again, some strong gusts approaching 70 to 90 miles an hour around the St. Paul and the Pribilofs region there, with high wind warnings in effect for you as well. So a lot of the wind still working through southwest, the Bristol Bay communities tonight, and certainly the Yukon Delta with snow falling there. Snow and wind will be somewhat less of a concern for the southwestern Bristol Bay communities and the Kuskokwim Delta. And then it's mainly wind as you head out toward the Pribilofs and the eastern Aleutian chain there for Akutan and toward the Alaska Peninsula. Here's a look at the satellite picture, and you can see the surge of moisture working inland across the west coast this afternoon and across the interior. Still looking at a lot of cloud cover up across the north, and for southeast we're still dealing with one wave of low pressure that's kind of working a little bit more toward the Pacific Northwest. It just grazed some of our central and southern parts of the Panhandle. Not a lot of snow falling in Juneau as of earlier this afternoon. You can see that northward push moisture before it kind of returns back out to south and east. There is rain and snow falling in parts of the higher terrain in southeast, and a little bit more rain as you head out toward Ketchikan and Annette. A look farther west shows the next wave of weather working through the region all the way into Kodiak, and it looks like this will probably bring some light snow into south central as well. Behind that, you can see this kind of textured cloud cover. This is very indicative of colder air flowing in behind that weather system, so we expect that conditions are going to cool down once again. However, high pressure building in quickly behind that will return a southerly flow to the region ahead of the next weather maker, and we're going to set up to do this all over again. Here's the weather map as of this evening. 978 millibar low there. just off the coast of Ammonic and around St. Matthew, the occlusion front right across the YK coastline, and then you can see the frontal boundaries kind of merging together across the North Pacific. When these two meet up, when the cold air meets up with the warm air, this entire line will become purple. That's the meaning of an occlusion there. The colder air is undercutting the warmer air, and it's kind of getting mixed up, as it were. Now, out across southeast, we see a 992 millibar low there south of Port Alexander. This is going to drop southward once again. High pressures across the western parts of Canada. And we have another strong circulation up across the open waters of the Chukchi at 984 millibars. Blowing snow with that. That's the reason the blizzard warning continues. And here's the marking of the leading edge of that next colder air mass as it moves off of Siberia and into the western Bering. A hint of high pressure out across the west. That moves eastward tonight to 1,038 millibars, or 1,038 millibars across the western chain, and low pressure across the YK Delta. The crossed arrows, of course, mean blowing snow. Poor visibility included with that, and periods of heavy snow across south and western Alaska down through the Alaska Peninsula, as well as wind. You can pick that out yourself if you're looking at the weather maps, and have with me for a while. Those tight lines again mean a very tight pressure gradient, and especially in Alaska where we have channeled terrain, valleys, mountains, and bays and passes. That means that wind's going to have to rush through there. So hold on to your hats for sure across the Alaska Peninsula and areas around Unalaska and eastward. The worst of the wind will be from Unalaska eastward through the Alaska Peninsula and Bristol Bay communities. Now in southeast, periods of rain and snow may still be possible. Watch for snow to creep in from the south and west around the Kenai Peninsula and Kodiak Island tonight, and pockets of snow across the interior. We had some reports of snow around Fairbanks this afternoon, but the worst of the weather across Northwest should start to improve, so blizzard conditions should start to get better in places like Point Hope and Point Lay. Thursday's weather, you still see a chance for some blowing and drifting snow across the western communities there, but the focus for the big wind is going to move out across the Gulf Coast and Bristol Bay. So you'll notice that wind moving through Bristol Bay. Still a very tight pressure gradient here. Rain across the coast. Might see some mixing around Valdez and Cordova, and during the afternoon the wind is really going to come up in Valdez, gusts through the canyon, the higher terrain, probably up around 70 miles an hour in some cases, and then rain for southeast, especially the inner channels. As you get up toward Chilkoot and White Pass, you might start to see snow, and visibility and travel conditions are going to start to change there. With high pressure across the chain, though, we'll break up some of the clouds, getting back into a southerly flow across the west. There's our next weather maker. Low pressure that was making blizzard conditions across the northwest coast is moving eastward. That pressure gradient relaxes, so things are improving here. Still looking at snow, and wind still whipping across south central. Winds are going to come up for Friday across many parts of the Matanuska and Susitna valleys, the Kenai, also across Prince William Sound. And more precipitation and snow still possible for parts of southeast, especially north of Juneau in toward the Lynn Canal. Southeast, you're still looking at breezy conditions and rain. What a mess for a holiday weekend. Wouldn't have it any other way. Let's take a quick check of your Thanksgiving Day temperatures. As we start out in the morning, we're looking at readings back anywhere from 5 to 10 below, maybe even 20 below out around Northway, Fort Yukon, Arctic Village. Across the North Slope, anywhere from 5 below to about 15 above, all the way from Kaktovik out toward Wainwright there around 16, 20 closer to Nome, parts of the Norton Sound communities in the upper teens, upper 20s for Bristol Bay, 31 in Kodiak, South Central, single digits up to about 20 in Homer. As you get into high temperatures tomorrow afternoon, 5 below to about 5 above for the central and eastern interior, teens for the North Slope, Southwest 20s and 30s, South Central you're looking at teens and 20s, 34 in Kodiak, 30s and 40s for Southeast, the Alaska Peninsula, the Pribilofs, and the chain looking at temperatures back in the 30s and 40s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
You'll continue to see IFR conditions across the northwest coast as we look at your flying weather for Thursday morning. Notice pockets of IFR across the upper Yukon and across southwest as wind and snow will continue to be an issue. Also across some of the higher terrain of southeast, MVFR for a large part of the interior and the west coast as well as southwest, the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island. Getting into Thursday afternoon, we expect to see IFR developing along a frontal boundary across the Gulf of Alaska and across the higher terrain of southeast, MVFR for the inner channels, most of the northern Gulf, and many locations across the Alaska and Canadian border. IFR conditions should be continuing across the North Slope, and MVFR conditions for many regions there across the Seward Peninsula, Norton Sound, out towards St. Lawrence Island, and another wave developing as you head out into the central and western Bering Sea. Once we get into Friday morning, we should see some improvement improvements across the interior. A large part of the lower, middle, and even the upper Yukon Valley will start to go back toward VFR conditions, but IFR lingers across the North Slope and the coastal plain north of Anaktuvuk and Adigan Pass. Across the Alaska Range, generally on the northern side again, you're looking at IFR conditions hovering through Friday morning. With the west coast seeing a little bit of improvement, but MVFR is expected to continue for Nunivak Island, St. Matthew down toward the Pribilofs, and not across the far western chain. For southeast, we expect to see MVFR pretty much from the Lynn Canal all the way down into Clarence Strait, with IFR across the higher terrain and perhaps right over Juneau as well for Friday. By the afternoon, expect some improvements, but IFR conditions should linger around the capital city, with MVFR through most of the central and southern parts of the inner channels, as well as the outer coast. For the interior, we expect to see IFR around Mentasta Pass all the way west toward Rainy and Windy Pass, and perhaps up toward the upper Yukon and Tanana Valleys. IFR continues for the coastal plain and many parts across the Beaufort Seacoast, with MVFR elsewhere. IFR conditions also expected as you head into the upper end of Kotzebue Sound and just south of Kotzebue itself, and moving eastward with another front moving through the western Bering Sea. Here's a look at your pass conditions in detail then as we get into Anaktuvuk Pass. MVFR conditions expected for your Thursday, Thanksgiving Day. Same goes for Adigan Pass. MVFR conditions should be seen there pretty much all day long. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, we expect to start at IFR, but some improvements should be had as we go throughout our day. Rainy Pass, MVFR through most of Thanksgiving Thursday. Windy Pass looking at visual flight rule there, so good news. Isabel Pass also expected to see VFR through most of the day. Mentasta Pass, we expect to see marginal conditions through most of your Thursday. Tanita Pass also looking at VFR. Portage Pass looks pretty good right now. If you're heading back and forth into Prince William Sound, things should be okay. And Chilkoot and White Pass also looking at marginal conditions through most of your Thanksgiving Thursday. On to freezing levels now. You can see the surface freezing line has dropped into the Gulf of Alaska once again, hovering near Nunivak Island and St. Matthew, and right over southeastern Alaska, just south of Juneau to just north of Sitka. South of that, we see our elevated freezing lines anywhere from 2 to 4, maybe as much as 6,000 feet out across the North Pacific, but by and large, most of the state is below freezing at the surface, and if not that, below the 2,000-foot freezing line for your morning tomorrow. Icing potential is a little bit up there, though. We do expect some snow, so a lot of what you see across the North Slope may be mitigated by that, but if it is not snowing, above 2,000 to 3,000 feet across the north and western coast should be expected there, with considerable moderate in some cases. Also across the northern Gulf Coast, generally isolated moderate, but a few hot spots there across the Kenai Peninsula and then across the western Gulf as you get into your Thursday. The jet stream right now shows a pretty large trough of low pressure across most of Alaska there. That's feeding in a lot of the storm track right into southeast and keeping the cold coming across western Alaska, anywhere from 110 to 170 knots there in the jet stream, with high pressure anchored across the desert southwest of the lower 48. Wind speeds there also reacting to that trough, 60 to 115 knots. At 9,000 feet, low pressure is centered up over the Gulf. We have a weak westerly flow across the eastern interior, but you can see that northwesterly flow we saw in the jet stream reflected at this level, anywhere from 50 to 70 knots from the north and west. Westerlies across the North Slope, and more of a south and westerly flow across southeastern Alaska. Gentle, or more gentle winds anyway, across the central and eastern Aleutians, with that northwesterly flow at 20 knots. At 3,000 feet, a similar pattern. A slightly more robust area of low pressure here, with stronger north and easterly winds around the Alaska range, anywhere from 60 to 70 knots, and also seeing that over Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula, 50 to 75 knots in those cases. Northerlies for most of the interior, and more of a west and northwesterly flow across the North Slope. Turbulence is really going to focus out on the western regions of Alaska as we go through your Thanksgiving Day, below 4,000 feet to 6,000 feet across south central, with considerable moderate in many locations. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and today I'm privileged to introduce Dr. Uccellini, the Director of the United States National Weather Service. Welcome back to Alaska, sir.
Thank you, Dave. Glad to be here.
Thanks. Prior to being the leader of the National Weather Service, your work included an extensive look at snowstorms across the northeastern United States. These are the types of storms that can bring some of the country's largest cities to its knees. Tell me a little bit about your fascination with snow.
Well, as far back as I can remember, I've always been interested in weather, growing up as a kid on Long Island, New York, and was particularly fascinated by snowstorms, why they occurred. The distribution of snow was very varied across the entire region, the rain-snow line. all those things fascinated me right from the get-go. And I was interested in knowing how they worked, how the forecast worked, or more often than not, didn't work one way or the other. And that drove me, that interest continued to build and drove me through high school right into college, wanting to be a meteorologist.
Okay, that's a fascinating story, and I think every meteorologist has a weather story like that in some way.
Right.
Due to Alaska's size and proximity to the North Pole, sometimes it's difficult to detect and analyze the weather patterns over Alaska. What's the National Weather Service doing to improve that weather detection?
Well, observations in this type of environment is a big challenge, whether it's from space or from what we call in situ observations from the ground or within the systems. Clearly, satellites have been playing an increasing role in providing the big picture, not only from a visual sense and what you see is occurring, but also from providing the data for numerical models that then are used to actually predict the weather. Alaska is actually pretty well positioned with respect to polar orbiting satellites, since you get a faster return of those satellites over your particular area. And in fact, the polar satellite system is the backbone for the observations that we use in our models, especially our global models, and they're particularly important for observing weather features that affect Alaska.
Alaskans live and die by the weather every day, and one of the strategic goals of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service is to develop a more weather-ready nation. What does it mean for Alaskans to be weather-ready?
Well, the strategic outcome is based on people being ready, responsive, and therefore resilient to the increasing threats to extreme weather events. Those threats are related to not only the nature of the events, but the fact that we're becoming more vulnerable to them as we have more people, more infrastructure that could be affected by these events. So we have to ensure that the observations we make for situational awareness, the forecasts we make for people to take the proper responses, are connected to people's actions, the response to these events, so that they will be more resilient to what's facing them. You know, there are examples with respect to hurricanes. More people living along the coastline takes longer to evacuate. We have to make better forecasts with longer lead times, but we also have to communicate the threat so people will actually take action to avoid those storms. Up here you have, as in other parts of the United States, an increasing threat related to fire. As there are more people living in fire-prone areas, we have to ensure that our forecasts are good, that we don't have false alarms that make people not react to the forecast when in fact they should. But we also have to be able to communicate the threat and make sure that we're working with the partners in the emergency management community so that communities and right down to individuals will actually take the proper responses in the face of these events. So that's the strategic goal. There are a lot of challenges for us in terms of improving forecasts, but also improving our communication skills and linking with the emergency management communities that are actually out there trying to protect lives and mitigate property loss.
So a huge partnership effort going forward.
That's one of the important keys for the success of meeting the strategic goal.
Okay. One of the things you're talking about was understanding the weather information we're getting back from the computers, weather modeling, and you did a lot of work with that in some of your prior positions with the Environmental Prediction Center there, the National Center for Environmental Prediction. What can you tell us about recent improvements in that weather modeling? And you were using the polar orbiters as kind of a source of information that started that process.
Well, you know, first of all, we have to recognize that everything you see, you read and hear about weather, climate, or ocean forecasts are all driven by numerical models. Now, it really has been the revolution in our forecast process in the last part of the 20th century. The success of that numerical enterprise is based on three factors: big computers, global data, not just local data, but you have to have a global data set, and then the models themselves, the science that's behind the models and in running the models in an operational mode. So we're working to improve all three of those components. We upgraded our computers last year. We're going through another upgrade even as I speak. We'll be upgrading from 200 trillion calculations per second to 700 trillion calculations per second by January of 2015. This increase in the computer will allow us to run what we call Earth system models. It's not just the atmosphere, it's the atmosphere, ocean, ice, which is obviously very important up here, and land models that are all coupled together at higher resolution. So you need the big computers, you need the science that allows us to run these models and run them in a parallel mode, and that they're coupled so that the ocean effects could affect the atmosphere and vice versa, as an example. And then the global observations are absolutely critical, and over the last 20, 30 years they've become more dependent upon the satellite systems, and especially the polar orbiting satellites, which help drive the observations needed for those models, whether they be atmospheric observations, land, ice observations. We're deriving more and more of that from satellites now that feed into these models and produce forecasts with extended lead times. Now out, for extreme events especially, we're seeing much improved forecast out in the 4, 5, 6, 7, and even 8-day range, which gets us back to Weather Ready Nation, because if you're going to get ready for a storm event, you want those consistent forecasts approaching that event from day 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, so you can take the actions several days in advance that can help mitigate the property loss and protect your livelihood.
Okay, all part of the mission of protecting life and property. Dr. Uccellini, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and speaking to Alaskans and sharing how the National Weather Service is working for Alaska and the nation. Wish you safe travels around the 49th. Enjoy your time here, sir. And for Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Time for a quick check of your sea ice edge. As of today, it looks like the Beaufort has been closed off. All of the Beaufort is covered up with pack ice now. A lot of that solidifying as we go further and further into the winter season. That is not the case for the Chukchi Sea. You can see an expansive area of open water. This is not normal by any stretch of the imagination. And we can also see quite a bit of ice that is starting to work up along the coast, but a lot of this has been pushed pretty hard up against the coastline itself, removing any ice that's been out across the water. Also a little more ice up across the upper Kotzebue Sound region, and filling in slowly around Norton Sound and some of our YK coastline there. This is the latest as of the 22nd of November. As always, you can check out the latest forecast and information yourself online at weather.gov/Anchorage/ice. Here's a look at the weather in southeast now. You'll see southerlies continuing for the central and southern parts of the Panhandle. Northerlies for the Lynn Canal, 20 knots with 4-foot seas there. Winds up to 15 knots across the outer coast, 10-foot seas in most areas with more of a south and easterly flow in the northern Gulf. As we get into Friday, north and easterly winds really start to pick up. Remember, we saw that pressure gradient. We'll get another look at it here again in a moment. But remember, it was really tightening up over southeast on Friday. This is what's going to happen. Gusts coming up to 45 knots out of the Lynn Canal, more of a southeasterly gust at 45 knots outside of Cross Sound, 13 to 14-foot seas across the outer coast, and 25 knots with 40-knot gusts across Stevens Passage, and further south, more of a southeasterly flow there. So windier conditions on Friday, as you see. South Central, not a bad day inside of Prince William Sound. Northeasterlies 15 knots with 3-foot seas on Thanksgiving Day. Northerlies inside of Cook Inlet 20 knots, 5-foot seas there. Northeasterlies coming out of Kachemak Bay and down toward the western Barrens, 9-foot seas. Winds across the northern Gulf easterly 30 knots with an 8-foot sea. Friday will be a little different. Northerlies really start to pick up. You're going to get some stronger gusts out of Valdez as well. 6-foot seas on the inside of Prince William Sound, 10 to 13-foot seas across the northern Gulf, and 8 to 10-foot seas across the Cook Inlet region west of the Barrens. Northwesterlies come up to about 40 knots for your Friday. Bristol Bay, northerlies 40 knots, 19-foot seas, and storm force winds across the Alaska Peninsula on either side there. High wind warnings on land, and get storm warnings there across the Bering and the North Pacific. 30 knots inside of Shelikof Strait with a 9-foot sea, 22-foot seas south of AKwx all the way out towards Sand Point, where the seas come up to 28 feet, 38 feet on the Bering Sea coast. Considerable improvement for Friday. Northwesterlies are still strong. That's from AKwx out towards Sand Point, where 45 to 50 knots should be expected. 16 to 21-foot seas there. Northerlies at 45 knots east of Kodiak Island, 17-foot seas on Friday. For the Aleutians, much nicer weather out in the west. Southerlies 15 to 25 there. Northwesterlies at storm force across Nikolsky to Unalaska. Strongest winds really from Akutan eastward, with gusts on land 70 to 90 miles per hour. You can see the higher seas there across the southern Bering Sea as well. As we get into Friday, much better conditions. Southerlies are picking up across the entire region, especially to the west, 30 and 40 knots. Their northwesterlies continue for Unalaska and Nikolsky, 15 knots on the north side, 10 knots, or 10-foot seas there, I should say, on the Pacific coast for Friday. The west coast, northwesterlies going strong Thursday from St. Matthew to the Pribilofs to the Kuskokwim Delta, 26 to 33-foot seas, 24-foot seas around St. Matthew, and north and westerlies up the Yukon coastline, northerlies inside of Norton Sound with 5-foot seas. For Friday, west and southwesterlies start to build in across the Pribilofs. You can see 25 knots with an 11-foot sea there, 12-foot seas around St. Matthew, and light northerlies developing around Norton Sound thanks to some of the protection. Northerlies at 20 knots with a 4-foot sea on Friday. And for the North Slope, you're looking at easterlies across the ice, 10 to 20 knot winds there. Otherwise, a strong north and westerly flow continues for Thursday and Thanksgiving Day, 25 to 40 knots for Thursday. And as we get into Friday, things start to ease up a little bit. More of a northwesterly onshore flow, but the winds just aren't as strong. Northerlies around Barrow, 3-foot seas there, and offshore winds for the Beaufort over the ice, 20 knots for your Friday. Let's recap the weather across Alaska. Still a west coast storm across the northwest. Blizzard conditions continue in many locations this evening and overnight. That should start to improve as we slowly go through your Thanksgiving Day tomorrow. The focus then shifts westward and south. Winter weather advisories, blizzard conditions, and also coastal flood advisories for many in the southwest. High wind warnings for the Pribilofs and for the Alaska Peninsula and Akutan as well. Gusts there 70 to 90 miles per hour. Snow will continue. Poor visibility should be expected across southwest for Thanksgiving Day. Very poor travel conditions, so do be careful. Rain back into southeast there with winds coming up as we head into Friday. Winds also coming up for south central Alaska as we get into your Friday afternoon. More rain and a chance for mixed precipitation across southeast and showers across the west. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.